What's up, gamers and players? Colorwind here with some reactions and thoughts to a recent news story that's quite big. So Sony has decided for the second year in a row to not have a presentation or even a booth, I believe, at E3 this year. This is going to be the second year that they've done this. They did this in E3 2019 and now are again going to do it in 2020. This is really surprising considering that Sony is going to be releasing a brand new console this year. The PlayStation 5 is set to be released in the holiday of 2020, and with a rumored full reveal coming out within possibly a month from now, it would seem like Sony would want as much press time as they can get, and E3 is one of the biggest press events of all year for video games. So, what does this mean? Well, at first thought, I think that it's a mistake, because Sony needs to have as much time as they need to push the PlayStation 5 over the new Xbox Series X that's going to be coming out around the same time. And we do know and have confirmation that Xbox and Microsoft will be at E3. So they're going to get a whole bunch of press time and eyes on them where Sony is not. However, it does bring up an interesting thought that it appears that Sony does not think it needs E3 anymore. Sony has shown up to other press conferences that they have held throughout various places of the world, so it's very interesting that they feel like they don't need E3 to promote the PlayStation 5 or, the other work that they have coming out. It seems to me that Sony feels like it's better off doing something on its own rather than share the spotlight with other companies at E3. The only thing that makes me question that is they used to have an event called PS Experience or PSX that they used to hold in December. They did that for I think 2 or 3 years and then they stopped and nothing really has replaced it. The closest thing is arguably the new State of Play presentations that they've been having, but those have been extremely lackluster and nothing major has really been announced in them. The closest was a trailer for Final Fantasy VII, but then the full reveal of that came later on at another event. So it seems to me that Sony feels like it can do something, maybe perhaps something that we don't know about yet, better than what's currently available. And that includes not only E3, but also its own specific tailored events. Perhaps they feel like they're going to be best at promoting the PlayStation 5 by having PlayStation 5 specific events. The PlayStation 4 was announced within its own presentation and event. That was all it was for. It was not part of a bigger exposition that was happening or a bigger event or conference. It was its own specialized thing. Perhaps Sony feels that when it's going to talk about the PlayStation 5, it's only going to be in the context of its own specific presentation. I don't see a lot of this being promoted through State of Play, because State of Play has been only mildly successful. I would have thought that maybe they would have taken advantage of E3, but now I'm not so sure about that. They have shown off a few details of the PlayStation 5 at other conventions, such as most recently at CES, but even there, the details were minuscule at best. So I feel like either Sony is going to promote this thing through special means that they have full control of, and that's why they're pulling out of E3, or maybe Sony doesn't really know what it's doing. I wouldn't put it past them, because For as much as everyone likes to say that these companies know always what they're doing, there's a lot of evidence to the contrary. However, I will say that it's not really in Sony to make a blunder this huge. Part of me, another thought that I had right now was that perhaps maybe they want to save money, and E3 is notorious for being very costly. But when you're announcing and getting ready to sell a whole new piece of hardware that is probably going to be the thing that you push for the next 5 to 8 years, this is where you start spending your money. This is it. So that would be extremely odd for them to have that kind of mindset. I will say that as a whole, what this shows is that the whole idea of E3 seems to not really be necessary anymore. After Nintendo kind of left it, partially, they still have a booth at E3, but they don't have actual live presentations at E3 anymore. They mostly just promote their stuff through their Nintendo Direct series. It seems to me like the idea of E3 seems to be becoming antiquated. And yet I also doubt that, considering that there are other conferences throughout the year in other countries that are still getting a lot of support. Gamescom comes to mind the most because it's arguably, I believe it is, the biggest conference in the world for video games. I just don't see why E3 can't be that. I know that it's had trouble with being both essentially a press event, but also was something that needed to appeal to investors. And then more recently, it's decided to open up to the public for charging for tickets. I don't see why you can't just do that and make it as big as Gamescom and accommodate all those things in one place. My first thought is maybe it's because of the LA Convention Center, which is where E3 is typically held. That place is not the biggest convention center, but I don't see why they just don't move it to a different location then. There's a convention center in Los Angeles, or not Los Angeles, but Las Vegas, that's, I believe, one of the biggest convention centers in the entire United States, if not the world. They could just have it there. And they can have sections within there that'll be specifically for press, specifically for fans, specifically for investors, and even a part that's for everybody. Maybe companies just don't want to spend the money anymore on the concept, because not only has Sony left, but Electronic Arts, the biggest publisher in the video games industry right now, doesn't even have a proper presentation at E3 either. They have their own side event called EA Play, which has never really been that exciting, but that's what they do, and they've been doing it for several years now. With that said, I don't really know. I suppose this ultimately does show that the whole concept of E3, and possibly even the ESA who put together the whole E3 conference, is a bit shaky. And it's because these companies now feel like they don't need each other. At least Sony doesn't. And maybe other companies feel that way, maybe they don't, but when Sony doesn't feel that way, that is saying something. It was one thing when Nintendo did it, because Nintendo likes to do things differently just for the sake of doing things differently. But when Sony doesn't want to, that is indicative of the strength of E3 and the ESA, quite frankly. But those are just my quick, immediate reactions and thoughts on the situation. Please let me know in the comments section what you think of Sony ditching E3 this year. With that said, thank you very much for watching, everyone. Peace and love, gamers and players. Fight on.